Kia ora koutou and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. I'm delighted to be hosting this very important conversation. Before we get underway, can I make awareness of our incredible partners who we're proud to work alongside for the economic and environmental benefit of New Zealand. Please note if you have any questions to use the Q&A and we'll endeavour to get through those. Thank you also to those who have already sent some of these through. Could I also recognise the support of our guardians, some of whom have in our audience today, and also our rangatahi advisory panel who provide valued advice for our work streams, and some of whom are also registered in our audience today. The topic of today's webinar is Rethinking Infrastructure from Risk to Resilience. This webinar comes nearly 2 months after the launch of our Natural Infrastructure Plan at Parliament. I do want to spend just 10 minutes setting the context for the discussion today, so to get everyone on the same page. The Natural Infrastructure Plan had the support of over 200 contributors and highlights the significant opportunity we have as a country to strengthen our under-pressure infrastructure system by recognising natural infrastructure as the productive infrastructure that it is. By including it as another tool in the infrastructure toolkit, our plan demonstrates we can strengthen our economy, reduce risk, create jobs, and build a future we can proudly say we helped shape. We believe investing in resilience and natural infrastructure is not a trade-off, it is a win-win. It can help us address today's challenges while building capacity for tomorrow. So what's holding us back? According to Infrastructure Commission, the infrastructure deficit is sitting at more than 200 billion. With up to 1 trillion needed over the next 30 years. Can I have the next slide, please? At a mounting climate exposure, and it's clear we can no longer afford to rely solely on traditional hard engineering solutions. What we need are solutions that offer us multiple benefits. And as the Infrastructure Commission has consistently highlighted in their plan, we cannot simply build our way out of these challenges. We need to invest more strategically, maintain what we have, and improve long-term resilience and system performance. We know our future prosperity depends on infrastructure and that we don't always get good value and longevity from built assets. So our natural infrastructure plan points instead to the multiple benefits that natural infrastructure offers, and realising them, however, requires a shift in conversation beyond hard engineering solutions. We all understand why infrastructure matters, as in the solutions it provides. For example, roads move goods and services, pipes deliver water and energy, bridges connect communities and enable commerce. But natural infrastructure is less visible and therefore often less valued. To clarify what the circle means when we talk about natural infrastructure, as the graphic shows, it exists in wetlands, native forests, dunes, rivers, and floodplains, and it quietly delivers essential services. For example, flood mitigation, water filtration, erosion control, carbon sequestration, and temperature regulation, all without sending invoices. Nature may be the most undervalued infrastructure asset we have. And because we undervalue it, we underinvest in it. And for too long, we have framed economic growth and environmental health as competing interests. The Natural Infrastructure Plan demonstrates that we can and must achieve both. Again, as the Infrastructure Commission has identified, long-term strategy and planning are essential to strengthening national resilience. Our plan adds a powerful tool to that evolving infrastructure toolkit. It highlights that natural infrastructure is not an alternative to traditional infrastructure, but a complement to it. In many ways, a multiplier of its effectiveness. The plan sets out 6 key recommendations to enable this shift from concept to practice. Certainly in an election year, there is only so much capacity for change. So we have 3 for the public sector. First is the opportunity to include natural infrastructure in the definition of infrastructure, specifically in Section 3 of the New Zealand Planning Bill 2025, and a cross-reference to the Natural Environment Bill 2025, which will soon be passed into law. Second is to recognise Aotearoa New Zealand's economic dependency on natural infrastructure as a national risk by explicitly including it within the National Risk and Resilience Framework. And third, to strengthen central and local government capability and understanding of natural infrastructure, including its ecosystem services and resilience benefits, so that it's not only considered but expected in options provided as part of infrastructure planning and design. For the private sector, there are also 3 recommendations. First, for the insurance sector, to raise awareness of the benefits of natural infrastructure and how it can support long-term insurability, affordability, and risk reduction. Second, continued innovation in funding and finance mechanisms that enable natural infrastructure to be delivered at scale. And third, just like the public sector, a strengthening of capabilities across the private sector by sharing case studies and real-world examples so that the financial, environmental, and co-benefit value of these solutions is better understood and more widely adopted. Alongside these recommendations, the plan also includes an investment decision toolkit and a multiple benefits evaluation framework. The first provides a structured way to evaluate natural infrastructure alongside traditional engineered solutions, enabling more consistent assessment of long-term value, risk reduction, and multiple co-benefits. The multiple benefits evaluation framework, together with the recommendations and tools, provides this practical roadmap, moving from recognition to implementation and from opportunity to expectation, so that natural infrastructure becomes embedded in how we plan, finance, and deliver infrastructure. Our plan also details our economic dependencies and growth opportunities. Natural infrastructure offers key sectors, namely towns and cities, or in other words, the built environment, the bioeconomy, blue economy, and tourism. And if you haven't read these, I encourage you to do so. The plan finally includes 6 case studies, one of which you will hear about today. Each demonstrates the measurable benefits of incorporating nature-based solutions into infrastructure planning in real-world settings. They encourage decision makers to widen the lens through which infrastructure investments are assessed, recognizing that the lowest upfront cost is not always the best long-term outcome in both financial and many other areas. So when making decisions that will shape infrastructure for decades, the greatest risk is not choosing the wrong option. The greatest risk is failing to consider all available options. So that context setting brings us to today. Our discussion brings perspectives from across the resilience system, including insurance, research, energy infrastructure, and infrastructure delivery. And our speakers will explore how we move beyond reacting to risk towards designing systems that will reduce it in the first place. Our ask is simple. Consider how natural infrastructure can be incorporated into the way infrastructure is designed, planned, financed, and delivered. Look for opportunities where natural systems can complement or replace engineering solutions and deliver more resilient outcomes. Thank you for joining us today. We are joined first by Jonathan Groves, Chief Executive and Managing Director of QBE Insurance New Zealand and Pacific. We will then hear from Claire Falk, Chief Executive of Brands, who will share insights on how we design and deliver infrastructure that is fit for the future. From there, we move into a critical but often under-recognised dimension, and why healthy natural infrastructure is key to long-term energy security, with Tracy Hickman, Chief Operating Officer of Genesis. And finally, we will hear a real-world application and an Aotearoa New Zealand first, a natural infrastructure solution featured as a key case study in the plan from Andrea Marshall, Head of Environmental Planning and Sustainability at the Airport. Thank you for all being here today, and I'll hand over to Jonathan to begin.
Thank you, Vicky, and kia ora koutou. Thank you for the opportunity to be part of today's conversation. I think when most people think about insurance, they tend to think about recovery. You know, a bad event happens and insurance really helps you get back on your feet. And that role is essential and always will be. And it's important everyone has that confidence that when something actually happens, insurers are there to help. But the reality is, if we're honest with ourselves, that is no longer enough. Recovery alone isn't sufficient. And the reality is, across the insurance sector, as risk increases, we can't just keep repairing the same damage in the same places repeatedly. If we do, costs rise, pressure on affordability grows, and resilience for many just moves further out of reach. And the reality is the conversation needs to change and is changing to talk more about resilience than about recovery. Now, insurance has a role to play in shifting that understanding, given that risk is actually the business that we're in. We see patterns at scale, we see where losses are occurring, we see what drives them, and importantly, we're seeing what changes over time. So yes, we pull risk and we pay claims, but we also generate insight through the data, the modelling, the research, and the lived experience that we have across regions, across countries, across geographies, and across decades. And it's important for the industry to really be using that knowledge earlier and more deliberately to help customers, communities, and decision makers make, frankly, better choices before the next event occurs. And really within that, there is a mindset shift from being there at the end of the process to really being much more there at the start of the process in the upstream when the decision is occurring. Now, as Vicky mentioned, the Fenwick Forum challenged the industry to move simply beyond sort of paying claims and playing a more active role in building resilience. And so we take that challenge very seriously. And as we've understood a great deal more about natural infrastructure over the recent years, we have this year made changes to actually our underwriting guidelines and our survey guidelines to actually be far more explicit in the acknowledgement of natural infrastructure to actually help manage risk and then reflect that in our pricing, which I think is really essential in terms of as a concrete first step. At the same time, we've also been looking at how we actually further enable and enrich mitigation. And with that, taking a portion of some of our customers' premiums and then reinvesting with them back in their business to lower the risk of loss, or if loss is occurring, to lower the impact of that loss at the same time. So they're quite deliberate, practical applications that we're taking to actually shift and reflect the understanding that we have of natural infrastructure. So for me also, the really encouraging piece is how sectors are really much more clearly coming together, and that's reflected very much across the panel we have. And the thing is that when decisions are aligned, when we are able to build smarter, we're able to leave space for nature to do its job and invest, frankly, with a much longer term view, resilience compounds. So the reality is loss is lower, systems are more reliable, and recovery is less disruptive because vulnerability has already been reduced. And that is really what we're after. And I think when you think about the insurance industry, the desire of the industry, the reality is we'd like to have as many risks as insurable as possible. There is no desire to see risks become uninsurable. And that's why a focus on things like natural infrastructure is so important. And the reality is, you know, recovery has traditionally been about reinstatement, putting businesses back to where they were. But increasingly, that simply misses the point, and it's actually a moment of opportunity, a chance actually for us to reduce future vulnerability and to rebuild in ways that make the next event less damaging, not just inevitable. So we're very focused on actually how we help customers at that time when the event does actually occur. And so when insurers bring that insight into that recovery, whether it's the claims experience, the extensive hazard data we collect and model, or lessons from other regions, whether it be here within New Zealand, across the Pacific, across a much broader geography, and indeed around the world, customers are in fact better equipped to make those decisions which strengthen resilience. And the reality is sometimes it's just modest changes. Sometimes they're harder decisions. But whatever it is, when layered across communities, across time, they actually materially change risk. And so when we zoom out, this very logic applies to natural infrastructure. Wetlands, floodplains, forests, coastal systems already play a critical role in managing risk. They slow water, they absorb flood peaks, stabilize land, and they reduce the severity of extreme events. So when these systems are healthy, risk is lower, damage is reduced, and recovery is faster. And the reality is when they're degraded or constrained, the opposite tends to happen. Events unfold faster, impacts are sharper, and losses escalate. And so from our perspective, from an insurance company standpoint, that isn't sort of abstract for us. That's what we experience and see every day. And therefore, natural infrastructure really directly influences exposure and vulnerability, which means it directly influences risk and therefore how we consider our pricing. And so unlike many engineered solutions, of course, natural systems are strengthening over time, given the space and the support that they need, which is one of the reasons why we've made the changes we have to our underwriting guidelines and our survey guidelines to really help reinforce and understand that with our customers. So the reality is we're repeatedly funding recovery after avoidable loss. As I've said, it's not sustainable. I think we really need to sort of hone in on that part of the message in conjunction with just how important natural infrastructure is to our long-term sustainability and actually keeping insurance affordable for everyone. And therefore, it just places that much greater emphasis on the fact that across insurance, finance, planning, energy, infrastructure, iwi, and communities, that actually the shared evidence tells us that we need to work together to create more of those incentives for natural infrastructure. It requires us to think differently, and it requires us to do things differently and really think about the long term. So I'm going to pause there and I'm going to hand over to Claire.
Thank you for the opportunity to be part of this conversation today. The construction sector plays a critical role in Aotearoa New Zealand's economy. It contributes more than 17 billion to GDP and supports hundreds of thousands of jobs. Alongside that economic contribution comes a significant environmental footprint. Buildings and construction account for around 20% of our natural carbon emissions and more than 60% of our total waste. So these numbers tell us two things. First, the sector has a real responsibility to do better, and second, it has an enormous opportunity to lead change. At Brands, we believe we can absolutely build better, and a key part of doing that is placing much greater value on our natural infrastructure. These systems underpin our built environment, managing water, absorbing shocks from extreme weather, and reducing long-term risk. Our strategic priorities at Brands, affordability, sustainability, resilience, and quality, all depend on investment in our natural infrastructure in conjunction with engineering solutions. You can't meaningfully separate them. Buildings don't exist in isolation, yet traditionally we've planned and designed as though they do. For Brands, improving this is about taking a systems approach to understanding risk. It's also about recognising that enduring solutions require collective effort across the sector and across different disciplines. We are hugely supportive of the Aotearoa Circle and celebrate the work that has gone into developing and sharing the National Infrastructure Plan. Initiatives like this matter because they bring the right people together. From Brands' perspective, there are three areas that we believe we can be most impactful in supporting this shift. Collaboration, using our research to provide the long-term thinking on behalf of the construction sector, and supporting decision-making with evidence through science. So if I start with collaboration, building with natural infrastructure requires a collective, system-wide response. Brands' role is to bring the right people together to co-create solutions that work in practice, not just on paper. We've invested in research impact project with the Natural Hazards Commission, the Insurance Council of New Zealand, CRESA, and leading universities called Rescue, Resilience via Evaluation, Science, Climate Understanding and Engineering. With the very recent weather events showing us the importance of understanding New Zealand's unique geography and climate and the associated risks that exist across the country, this research is incredibly timely. The project will look at how we can use our current understanding of building durability to anticipate how climate change may impact future resilience and sustainability decisions made in the built environment. It's projects like these that bring together different parts of the system and allow us to identify and quantify the value and role of natural infrastructure. Aligning building with natural infrastructure isn't just a design challenge, it's a skills and capability challenge. For brands, turning science into useful information for the sector is where we can make a huge difference, which is my second point about how we work to undertake long-term thinking on behalf of the construction sector, not just in translating findings of research, but working right across the value chain, including influencing the skills that are nurtured in the sector to support a more resilient future. Our research in the area of the future of the construction workforce is an example of this. We've been involved in identifying the skills and qualifications needed in our workforce to ensure that natural infrastructure is considered as part of a more resilient future. Plus, we have contributed to the International UNESCO report on transforming training and vocational education. This report looks at the need for better training for the construction sector around building material, carbon emissions, and life cycles, biodiversity impacts, waste management, energy efficient build and design, and digital skills around build information modelling. Finally, brands can offer trusted scientific data to underpin decisions that impact infrastructure into the future. Aotearoa's environment has unique challenges when it comes to resilience. Our weather patterns and geothermal activity contribute to a complex picture. Understanding this is an important piece of understanding our natural infrastructure. Brands Maps is a tool that overlays data on climate zones, rainfall, earthquake risk, corrosion severity, and more to a single location. We're currently updating this tool as one of our most popular tools for the sector to ensure that we have the most up-to-date data available. Its most critical layers are developed and maintained by brands underpinned by long-running exposure monitoring, field testing, and applied building science. This includes brands' 10-year corrosion study across 181 sites, extensive seismic research following major earthquakes, and wind research aligned with New Zealand standards. Because where we build will increasingly be a critical decision point going forward. Having the right data to underpin these decisions is paramount. A recent study conducted in the Chatham Islands highlighted how building performance can be directly impacted by location. However, our building standards have not traditionally reflected that. This study demonstrated, among other things, that a 1 millimetre carbon steel plate, usually expected to last over 50 years, disappeared in just 1 year. As a result, we've been able to influence New Zealand's building standards around corrosivity and have them changed to reflect the findings. Investing in understanding our unique natural environment and how that interacts with our built environment is foundational to a more resilient future. It is research science, like I've mentioned, which gives us the knowledge we need to build better in the future. Research is key to understanding the value and role of our natural infrastructure and collaborating to ensure this knowledge is accessible to the construction sector and the system as a whole. Now, Tracy, can I hand over to you to share your perspectives from Genesis?
Kia ora, Claire, and kia ora tātou, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the energy sector and the importance of natural infrastructure for energy security and resilience. Before I do, though, I just wanted to note the importance of this conversation and the mindset change that comes with thinking about the environment as infrastructure in the same way we think about our built assets as infrastructure, which the sector's been very good at doing. I suspect this mindset change is obvious and natural to most of you, but I think we've got a long way to go as a business and as a sector and as a nation to understand why that mindset change is so critical. So look, I've worked in the energy sector for over 30 years and mostly in the area of electricity generation, focusing on investing in and maintaining and operating our turbines, our generators, our dams, and our water intakes, that sort of built infrastructure. My undergraduate degrees were in geography and then a master's in natural resource management. And I can't tell you how many times I've been asked over the last many years, including recently, what on earth my professional training has to do with managing power schemes. And it's always astounded me, to be honest, that given the energy sector's utter reliance on natural infrastructure as the absolute foundation and backbone of what we do, why that continues to be a question. But I have to admit that when the sort of concept of natural infrastructure was first introduced to me as someone with a resource management and environmental background, I struggled a bit to understand its real relevance and the context change that we need to bring as a result of that mindset. And I realised that the impact of depleted natural infrastructure that is having on our business, and I started to see examples of it increasingly. And just by way of one example, just a few weeks ago, I was out on the side of Mount Ruapehu at our Tongariro power scheme, and we've got down there a water aqueduct that diverts a bunch of different streams from one catchment into another to generate electricity. On the one hand, actually this water that I'm talking about is the most valuable water in New Zealand. It generates electricity at 3 power stations on the Tongariro power scheme, but then that water then flows into Lake Taupo and generates electricity at another 8 power stations on the Waikato River chain. On the other hand, the diversion of that water has a significant cultural and spiritual impact for mana whenua, and that requires, through collaboration with them, we release some of that water back into the natural system to offset some of those impacts. But on top of that delicate balance, what I witnessed that I hadn't seen over the years so much when I was out there was that these intakes are now continually blocking with debris and sediment as a result of an unstable catchment above those intakes, and probably as a result of much more extreme weather events, which is mobilising that material, blocking the intakes and causing us to spill more water more regularly, and actually causing us more cost and having to send machinery out to remote sites to unblock those intakes. So our company has no impact on the catchment above, and I think traditionally we probably wouldn't have even thought about it. But the degraded state of that catchment is causing us to lose water. It's causing us, as a result, to lose megawatts, ourselves and others downstream, and also dollars. So we've been used to investing in the intakes, the built infrastructure, but we are now increasingly having to think about how we invest in the natural infrastructure, i.e. the stabilisation of those catchments that we may or may not impact above them, being a much smarter way and a much more sustainable way of sustaining our business. From an energy security perspective, as you know, New Zealand is striving to achieve net zero by 2050. To do so, we need to electrify about 60% of our economy. We're currently sitting at only around 30%, so that means converting from fossil fuels and transport in our homes and businesses, so that's going to mean a huge amount more demand for electricity, and therefore that we generate more electricity. We also need around 95% of all of that electricity generated to come from renewable sources, and we need to make sure we protect the existing renewable resources so we don't deplete them. They can continue to do their job whilst we build new assets, and we also need to ensure that that electricity supply is secure and reliable, and that means making sure we've got backup in the case of Mother Nature not showing up through wind, sun or hydrology. And so generating electricity, no matter what the fuel we are talking about, water, sun, wind, geothermal, coal or gas even, relies on access to natural resources. and therefore healthy ecosystems as core assets. And it's become increasingly obvious over the years I've worked in this industry of the need to think about them from an investment perspective, focusing on their upkeep in the same way we do our built assets, but haven't so much traditionally. If you look at it purely as numbers on a page, just our company uses nearly 5 million megalitres of fresh water. That's a figure from the last financial year just to generate electricity. So we've got 4 power schemes that are the backbone of our business operations, and they all rely on uninterrupted access to freshwater ecosystems to do so. If the water we are diverting is degraded by sediment, by weed, by debris, golden clams even, one of our more recent challenges, or for example, temperature impact, in the case of our thermal power stations, then our ability to generate electricity is impeded. So if the catchments above the streams and the rivers we are diverting are becoming more and more unstable due to vegetation changes, more extreme weather events, less stability and less resilience, then we'll suffer more flooding of our built assets, more damage to them, potentially more spill past our assets, and an increasing financial impact on our business. So we've got to make choices, address the impact on our business through investing in the built infrastructure, intake screens, filtration systems, and I think that in many cases makes sense, but increasingly we have to invest in the natural infrastructure to restore it to a state where it can sustain its natural values and therefore support our business far more sustainably. As we've already heard, nature's ability to absorb floodwaters, stabilise soils and filter sediment lowers outages, maintenance and replacement costs for energy assets and transport corridors. And these natural buffers make our systems and communities far more resilient to extreme weather events. Look, we've been involved ourselves in significant investment. 2 examples more recently around the Huntly Power Station, where we've worked with local communities and mana whenua around wetland restoration. It both absorbs carbon and it significantly reduces our vulnerability to temperature impacts on water, but also flooding risk, and it improves water quality in a way that we benefit from. So we've got to adopt intergenerational thinking and investment, both to invest in our long-term sustainable businesses and, of course, in order to be good ancestors. We're definitely finding that partnering with iwi on these projects is making really good sense. And I think if we put ourselves, far more in an iwi long-term sustainable mindset, it's definitely showing up for us in a really strong commercial sense as well. And those conversations and those collaborations with iwi, I think, are challenging us to think in new ways, which is actually making good sense for our business. Really good example of some of the work that we've been doing with Ngāti Tūwhara Hapu, and that's on a multi-year commitment to a more comprehensive program around tuna or eels, both alva migration upstream and tuna or adult eel migration back downstream. This program involves both passive solutions such as passes and pumps and manual transfer to enable tuna to move both up and downstream. A long-term outcome of this program would be to see whether there are sustainable numbers of tuna to determine if and how many could be harvested for cultural practices, i.e. the ability for Māori to use them for traditional practices as a food source in a way that is becoming increasingly challenged. So this shifts our support for natural infrastructure from being grounded in the use of fresh water to being more hand in hand with mahinga kai values, i.e. restoring cultural practices, which is quite different to the numbers on a page thinking, but an important step to help us build that muscle in areas that align with long-term desired outcomes and actions in the natural infrastructure plan. So look, in closing, and there's tons more examples that I could provide, but really just to want to reinforce how this mindset change to investment in the natural infrastructure is making far more sense to us as we build that resilience for our business, and it's continuing to really challenge us in a really positive way. We've got an opportunity to shift from the short-term investment gains to long-term returns by treating natural infrastructure as productive infrastructure that can address both New Zealand's economic and environmental challenges. New Zealand's natural infrastructure has the potential, in our view, to be a point of difference. and in a way to help attract international capital land in the country as well. So at that point, and I'll take questions later, I'll hand to you, Andrea.
Thanks, Tracy, and thanks to the Circle for the opportunity to share details about Auckland Airport's Couple Wetland Biofilter. It's a project that we're really proud of, particularly given that it's the first nature-based device of its kind in the country. The Couple Wetland Biofilter was part of a project to convert 108 hectares of undeveloped land into impervious areas to be used for taxiways and aircraft parking spaces. This land conversion required extra capacity of our stormwater systems to be developed. You'd think that would be relatively easy, but this project had some quite unique challenges, which meant we needed to really think beyond traditional solutions. The first key challenge really related to the location. The best location for the stormwater pond also happened to be highly valuable and relatively scarce aeronautical land. So any solution needed to avoid sacrificing that prime real estate for an airport. The second challenge really related to environmental standards. We knew that our stormwater discharge consents were going to expire in 2030, but we had no certainty about what those future standards might require from us in terms of contaminant treatment. So we needed to ensure that any solution was going to lift this environmental performance standards quite significantly, because we were adamant that we wanted to remain in that best practice space in terms of environmental management and the protection of the Manukau Harbour. And the third challenge really related to the need to future-proof. The solution needed to be able to accommodate incremental growth. It was really important to us that we didn't overbuild stormwater capacity ahead of when we needed that. The solution also needed to be able to handle the impacts of climate change, particularly the extreme weather events and the sea level rise that we expect to face in the future. We were really mindful that this infrastructure was going to be a long-term asset for the airport. Given its location, it's not a location that we want to go back in and again and make amendments. So we partnered with Becca to help come up with a solution, and the outcome was the coupled wetland biofilter technology. While wetlands and biofilters are not unusual in themselves, combining both of these two elements together was the first of its kind in New Zealand. The couple wetland biofilter provides additional contaminant removal, as well as supporting the improved flood protection and climate resilience. And that became increasingly important as the project progressed through the design, given the January 2023 flood events and the flooding of the terminal. This was going to service the catchment that was going to take pressure off the international terminal. Construction was completed in July 2025, and I just thought I'd pause and take a few moments to sort of explain how the couple wetland biofilter actually works. There's three distinct parts. There's the forebay, and that contains coarse sediment, and that allows coarse sediment to actually settle. When the forebay is actually full, the water overflows, overtops a weir and goes into a wetland. The wetland has shallow and deeper areas, mimicking the natural environment, with some 20,000 native plants provides the bulk of the treatment. Typically, this treated water then is discharged direct to the outlet, but in larger flows, it needs to overflow into the biofilter. Once the water's in the biofilter, the water's pushed down through soil media that provides extra filtration. There's another 2,500 native plants in this biofilter region of the pond. This component means that we're still treating water in heavy rain events rather than discharging direct to the coast like we do today before this pond was commissioned. But in extreme weather events, we've also have an overflow facility that means that the water does get directed to the coast, but it's still an improvement on what we have today because it has been treated through the wetland facility before it's getting into the biofilter. What was really important for us at the airport was this technology enabled us to build a pond in an area that was really constrained for us. It's a third of the area of a traditional pond that would service this land area. Thus, we were able to protect that highly valuable aeronautical land. So while we had challenges at the start, we also had challenges when we came up with the solution that we wanted to pursue. One of the key aspects was getting the council as a regulator comfortable with using different technology to achieve the environmental standards. The Auckland District Plan didn't accommodate for this sort of technology, so we had to spend a lot of time with the council as the regulator, getting them comfortable that the most of this parameter did fall within our existing global stormwater consents, but also getting them comfortable that we could have consents to do the other balance, but there was checks and balances in place where monitoring, and there was elements that could be altered and tweaked to lift performance if the pond didn't perform in the way that we had designed. The open water and forebay and native plants in the wetland and biofilter also created a great habitat for birds. This had the potential to increase the bird strike risk for aircraft. And we had to work really closely with the wildlife management team here at the airport on plant selection, but we ended up deciding that that risk was too great, and so the whole of the pond has been covered in netting. It's like a large aviary, but we stop the birds getting in rather than the birds getting out. So we're nearly a year on from commissioning this pond. Monitoring results to date indicate that everything is working to the design standards, and we're delivering between 2 and 3 times uplift in environmental performance than what we would have done if we'd had constructed a traditional pond. We've had a few issues of plants dying in the drier periods, and we continue to work through these issues and test different species. But a year on, that we're really proud of this Kapel Wetland Biofilter project. It's turned into a landmark stormwater project for New Zealand, with really strong interest from other councils, engineers and developers and other stakeholders of how they may use this technology into the future. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those amazing conversations. It's hugely insightful. I'm delighted to bring back our 4 speakers. Thanks again for your thoughtful, insightful, thought-provoking commentary about how we can move from reacting to risk to shifting to resilience, and how natural infrastructure requires a shift in our mindset and some elaborate collaborative thinking. Andrea, you were just speaking about your case study and obviously the multiple benefits that have come from this approach and how you've future-proofed it and aligned with your 2047 master plan. What gave you and the board confidence to adopt a solution that hadn't actually been used in a New Zealand setting before?
We're really fortunate that we've got a board that's very interested in delivering wider benefits than just the economic benefits, and how do we balance that. We were fortunate, I suppose, also that we had a strong economic driver to explore alternatives. We really knew that the traditional stormwater pond was going to have huge economic impact. We would have taken out 2 aeronautical stands for aircraft, and that has huge value to us, not only as the airport, but to the New Zealand economy. So really to get the board having confidence of using that new technology here in New Zealand was we benchmarked the performance of traditional wetlands and biofilters in New Zealand, just really trying to understand and test how much risk were we taking on, what was that performance stretch that we were asking the Kapel Wetland Biofilter to achieve, and then to really by understanding that risk, we got a greater comfort that it was likely to work to the design standards. But we also looked overseas. The Kapel Wetland Biofilters have been used overseas, not necessarily in weather environments that we have here in Auckland. They were tended to be in drier habitats and drier settings, but really were those Kappa wetland biofilters achieving the performance specifications and the design specifications, or were they underperforming? So that also gave us a better handle on the risk that we may have been taking on in terms of using this new technology. But we also asked ourselves, what would happen? What would we do if it didn't work? So we tried to future-proof the plan B. So could we build the Kappa wetland biofilter in such a way that we could adjust its performance and build future resilience if needed, if the technology didn't prove that it was delivering? We also made sure that we constructed and located the Kappa wetland biofilter in a way that didn't foreclose having to revert to a traditional method if we needed to, even though that was the last thing we wanted to do. It had economic implications, but we designed and built in such a way that there wouldn't be regret spend if the design and the technology didn't really work.
Thank you. And obviously your CWB drew on international experience. Jonathan, if I could just move to you around from that global experience from an insurance perspective, what is QBE learning from its research and global experience about what actually works in building resilience and addressing that vulnerability that you spoke to earlier?
Yeah, thanks, Jo. Well, I mean, the big reveal is it isn't lots of shiny technology. It's actually about better decisions. And it's about the timing of those decisions. So a lot of the challenges we face have already essentially been locked in by decades of decisions around building, choosing to build on floodplains, constraining rivers, whether it's hard edging coastlines or relying on purely engineered defences alone. And so the evidence simply shows that those have struggled over time. And actually you often see, like particularly in the case of rivers, the water come right back to where the original course of the river actually was. So what works better is where we see sort of more adaptive, place-based decision making, giving the natural systems space and making staged choices rather than locking in sort of one solution forever. And this sort of the concept of adaptive pathways really we think is essential to how we look at things going forward. And then it's actually about taking opportunity when the time arises. So those, I suppose, those recovery moments are really, really important. They're very powerful. So actually looking at claims data so that when we're looking at the next claim like that, we're using the hazard modelling we have to refactor those pieces into rebuild decisions so that we don't just keep building back in exactly the same way. And I think that's where the research that gets done by others as well as our own research and hazard analysis really needs to be importantly used in that approach. So I mean the common thread really is it's actually about that sort of flexibility and collaboration and actually taking the time on those decisions. They would be the key things for us from the research that we've done.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously those extreme events are certainly increasing. Tracy, we obviously had one. We're obviously just having one at the moment, but obviously Cyclone Gabrielle was a significant event for New Zealand. What have you learned from events such as that?
Thanks, Jo. Yeah, looks like Cyclone Gabrielle was a massive one for the country, and I think it's really raised our mindsets about how we plan, how we think about risk. Often we look to the past to understand risk, and I think we're now seeing impacts that we've never seen before. Gabrielle, really hit our Waikaremoana power scheme up in the Aotearoa. It's nearly 100 years old, that power scheme, and during Cyclone Gabrielle and in a number of events since, we're seeing stability issues on hillsides and flooding occurring in ways that have never happened in the last 100 years. So, we all know that it's real, it's happening. We've got to think really differently about it. I think the key thing we really have learned, though, is that as communities are on the end of those sorts of events, it's really impacting on their resilience. In the aftermath of Gabrielle, those communities around Wairoa in that area, they were broken, to be honest. They suffered huge amounts of flood damage that's impacted on their well-being. And what we saw with them, basically looked to, why is this happening? And when you've got a large dam upstream of your area of flooding, it is the first port of call to blame. And so what we've, and we learned after that, it became a real tension So we're really now investing far more so in broader relationships within community, more transparency around what are our assets, what can and can't they do, how can they both represent risk that we need to collectively mitigate, but how can they represent opportunity for managing our assets in a different way that can actually offset or mitigate some of those downstream effects. So for us, through all of the operational understanding, it's actually come back to relationships, building much closer and more transparent relationships with a wider community than we would have had than just around our assets, into building confidence so that in advance of a flood or in the aftermath of a flood, people know who we are, we know what we can and we can't do, and actually can build that trust. And so we're sort of taking that example from Aotearoa and Cyclone Gabrielle and thinking more broadly across our other assets as well around our involvement with community.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you. Claire, you spoke about the role that brands is playing in, delivering that trusted science and data, but obviously research as we build better for the future. Can you elaborate a little bit on that role that research is playing and understanding the value of natural infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you, Jo. I think obviously I believe research plays a critical role in making the value of natural infrastructure visible, credible and actionable. I think it's really important that decision makers at either board or local government or central government level are making decisions based on evidence and science. If I think about one of the other case studies, if I can touch on it, that's set in the national in the Natural Infrastructure Plan, brands hosted the National Science Challenge, Building Better Homes, Towns and Cities, and invested in developing a tool referenced in the Kirimoko Park case study. And it's a really important example of how the research was brought in alongside early in the design to really help those decision makers make good choices around investment. And for me, I see research turning natural infrastructure from something that we appreciate intuitively. We see it every day on the goods and the bad days, and being based in Wellington right now, there's some pretty tough days, into something we can really value and prioritise and confidently invest in alongside what we more readily consider in conventional infrastructure.
Thank you so much. I'm really conscious we're getting close to the hour. So we have had a few questions come in that we haven't had a chance to address, but we will cover those off in our post-webinar comms along with a survey link, which would Sue really appreciate you completing. But I'm just going to hand back to Vicky now to close, but thanks again.
Before I thank our speakers, I do just want to state that today's webinar is still just the beginning. We're pleased to invite you to our next webinar on the 28th of July, which will be from plan to practice in terms of unlocking the Natural Infrastructure Plan toolkit. And that session will move from concepts to application and provide practical guidance on how to use the tools and frameworks from the plan, including the investment decision toolkit and supporting resources. We'll include that registration link in our post-webinar communications. So please, thank you to the speakers today, to Jonathan, Claire, Andrea and Tracy. We obviously couldn't do this webinar without you and all the expertise, guidance, examples that you can bring to our audience. So thank you, and ngā mihi nui. Look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Vicky, thank you.